In the late 1900s, humanity was just discovering how to use film and filmmaking to tell stories. So naturally, just a few years later, this new form of communication was adopted by major world governments for political reasons. And thus, the earliest propaganda films were born. The first recorded use of propaganda in film was the 1912 Romanian silent film The Independence of Romania, a 2-hour-long war film that focused on retelling the Romanian War of Independence with a more nationalistic twist. But although propaganda has been around since the beginning of cinema, it's grown and taken lots of shapes through the ages. Earlier propaganda films, such as the ones mentioned above, and other films made around World War I, were blatant and obvious in its political messaging. A lot of people have the idea that these early films are what propaganda is, and that propaganda in films may have died out over time. But that couldn't be further from the truth. They are still alive and kicking, making millions at the box office every year. So if the way propaganda has been made over time has also changed, then what does it take for a film to become propaganda? Well, to answer that, first we'll have to specifically define propaganda for how we'll use it in this video, something that's more easily said than done. So the very basic base definition of propaganda that you'll learn in your first history class is any form of communication made to influence the public to follow a belief. But that definition doesn't really give us anything. It is so loose of a definition that it could realistically be applied to everything, especially for a medium like film, where every film you make is supposed to have some meaning behind it. When does a message stop becoming a theme and start becoming propaganda? Propaganda uses lots of different methods to spread its message, so defining it under a strict set of terms can be difficult. Often it's cited that propaganda uses misrepresentation, exaggerations, or straight-up lies to get its message across, and oftentimes it does. But does it always? Take those classic Uncle Sam posters. Undoubtedly, it was American military propaganda. But was it based on a lie? No, not really. All it did was motivate Americans to join the military and have some unifying sense of pride under a symbol. In this example, instead of lying or misrepresenting its point, it just plays on the consumer's emotions to motivate them. Okay, so it plays on emotions, or it can misrepresent a situation to influence the viewer. But even as we further define propaganda, it still continues to be a bit elusive. I mean, playing on emotions and misrepresenting a situation aren't exactly concrete definitions, and they may become even less defined when applied to something as abstract as art can become. They may seem like terms that can be easily applied to films and how they convince their audiences of certain ideas, but let me give you an example here, and I want you to not focus on your immediate reaction to what I'm going to say, but to analyze the film with all the context I'm about to give. The 2023 film Sound of Freedom follows the quote-unquote true story of Tim Ballard, a US agent that goes to Colombia to kill sex traffickers and save some kids. And that's basically what happens. There's no real character development or anything unexpected. He just saves these kids, and that's it. Now, if we don't analyze the movie further at all, then one could reasonably say this is just a thriller movie with an anti-human trafficking message. It plays on emotions to push its message across, and also throughout the process, the audience learns a little bit about human trafficking and how it's done. Hardly anything dangerous or disingenuous here. Well, let's take a closer look at the people who made the film. Tim Ballard, the person who the film is based on and who was heavily involved in its production, and Jim Casabiel, who portrays him in the film, are both believers in QAnon and the conspiracies around child trafficking and organ donations, something they are both vocal activists of, and something you will undoubtedly discover if you decide to do more research on human trafficking based on this movie. The person who produced the movie, Eduardo Verastegui, is a Mexican actor who is also a born-again Christian who, on top of being a vocal anti-abortion activist, has also worked politically with Donald Trump and Vox, the right-wing ultranationalist conservative party of Spain. Christian ideology was an integral part of the marketing for this movie, with a large number of the people watching the movie on opening weekend watching because it was marketed as a Christian film. The film itself also depicts human trafficking and rescuing victims of said trafficking in a very specific way, with the victims being snatched off the street or kidnapped, and the solution to said kidnapping being a vigilante mission that saves them through physical force and violence. But presenting it in this way really just ignores the realities of the victims of trafficking. Those kidnappings the movie presents are only really responsible for 10% of all trafficking cases. The vast majority of trafficking victims are lured into it by someone they know, often for reasons such as food, shelter, comfort, or money. By presenting this false narrative that victims of trafficking are taken by a stranger or a foreigner, the movie can ignore that most victims are simply taken advantage of because they are poor, in a bad situation, and had no other support, and focus on presenting the issue as something that can be physically prevented with violence, rather than something with structural change. The way these kids are saved is also alarming, with the movie presenting it as some action mission that has a sense of adventure to it. In reality, these international solo operations are dangerous, often illegal, and have little to no effect on human trafficking as a whole. Usually when human trafficking busts are done, they're massive international coordinated efforts that very rarely become the action-filled adventure portrayed in this story. But what am I talking about? It's all a true story, isn't it? I hear you ask. While the mission was real, let's look at what he did after. He quit his job and created Operation Underground Railroad, an organization focused on saving people from human trafficking. But his organization isn't really all that either. On top of spreading the same QAnon lies he does, they've also come under fire for, at times, exaggerating the work they do and moving the conversation around human trafficking away from systemic change and more towards military solutions. A Vice reporter discovered people who have volunteered at OUR have raised concern that it could actually have been creating demand for trafficking victims by going to foreign countries on undercover missions that at times have seemed to consist of walking around bars and sex clubs asking for underage girls. So yeah, those are the people who made this movie. If for some reason you're still on its side because it spreads awareness, ask yourself how. Did this movie convince someone who thought human trafficking was good that it's actually bad? Did it teach someone that human trafficking exists? No, it didn't do any of those things. Realistically, the only tangible effect this movie had was misrepresenting a real issue and its solution, and stoked a sense of violent vigilantism in a country where murdering your neighbor for minor inconveniences is already widely accepted. As you can see, what started off as a simple thriller movie with an anti-human trafficking message can be propaganda, by infusing its story with a misrepresentation of facts, as well as the emotional appeal of it being a true story and following from the perspective of the selfless, righteous white savior. And for those of you who don't think propaganda has an effect on people today, I think this movie certainly proves it does. It made $177 million, and it was just shown in cinemas all around the US. Now that that's been discussed, we can focus on another difficult aspect of defining propaganda, that being, when does a movie's message stop being a theme and start being propaganda? Other forms of propaganda, which aren't also considered art, don't have this issue. You can mostly tell when a poster is trying to sell you something, whether it's an idea or a product. But films are trickier. Art is supposed to make you feel something. We know that propaganda often relies on selective misrepresentation and playing on emotions, but again, as I'll show in a few minutes, this isn't always the case. Truth be told, there isn't really a clear-cut way to find out if something is propaganda or not. Movies that are blatantly obvious propaganda exist, of course, but more often than not, to find out how a movie is propaganda changes on a case-by-case basis. It becomes even more difficult to analyze when we also take into account that propaganda isn't inherently a bad thing. What if the subject of the film was to spread awareness of public health? Take the wave of films that came out during and after the AIDS epidemic, most of which featured a young gay kid dying of the virus at the end of the movie. Some of them went into statistics and the conditions of gay men during the time, but the majority of them focused on some sort of emotional response to get its message across. Or how about the 1968 documentary Black Panthers, a film that allows several Black Panther Party members to discuss aspects of their daily lives, oppression they receive at the hands of the United States, and their Marxist political leanings. At the time, the Black Panther Party was heavily criticized in the media and depicted as a gang of criminals, and with this film, Agnes Varda was able to portray the truth of their situation. Neither of these films have a negative message or impact on the world, and yet they still become propaganda in an attempt to educate and convince the public of a specific action or ideology. I'm going to now talk about some specific examples of propaganda in depth to illustrate what it meant. And I'm mostly going to focus on the content of the film, how its message is portrayed, as well as the society it was made in and how it interacted with said society. I'm going to start with the older ones and transition to more modern day examples, so I've left chapters in the description so that you can jump around to whatever section interests you the most. Starting off with one of the most infamous examples, however, I'm going to talk about Leni Riefenstahl's 1935 film Triumph des Willens, or Triumph of the Will. One of the most obvious forms of propaganda. This film was commissioned by Hitler himself, and he served as its executive producer. I actually watched this movie for the research of this video. It was the only movie I wanted to talk about that I hadn't previously seen, with the exception of Sound of Freedom. I was quite surprised to find that most of the videos I've seen of Hitler himself actually came out of this documentary, so in that sense, it was an interesting watch to see some of the most hated political figures of all time being revered by tens of thousands. For those who don't know, Triumph of the Will is a documentary propaganda film, meaning the film doesn't include any reconstructed scenes. All the moments captured on camera actually happened, with the exception of a few interviews that had to be reshot due to audio issues. The film is made up of captured footage from the 1934 Nazi Party Congress in Nuremberg, which lasted for a few days and included things like rallies, speeches given by party officials, and activities for the Hitler Youth to do as well. Now, this claim does lead a few people to say that Triumph of the Will can't be propaganda if it's just a documentary, but as we'll talk about it in a few moments, there are some deliberate choices made by the filmmaker that prevent it from being a truthful film. One of the things that really surprised me about this film is actually how boring it is. It's incredibly dragged out. There are very long sequences showing just the crowds and the landscapes, and since the film is composed of 4 different days and events, a lot of the film is spent on just establishing the setting. There are excerpts of speeches given by various members of the Nazi Party, but even those are very boring, monotonous, and basic politician speeches, basically saying the Nazi Party stands for freedom, or Germany is better when we're united. It really surprised me how general their speeches were, often just alluding to a vague concept like freedom and greatness that has no tangible way to be measured or achieved rather than any specific goals in mind. And it really reminded me of how a lot of politicians talk today. There isn't any talk of war or genocide, and the only explicit instance of racism is when the founder of a popular anti-Semitic newspaper at the time states that a country must protect its racial purity. The film closes off on Hitler giving a speech about how all loyal Germans are members of the Nazi Party. The crowd hails him, and then the film pretty much ends.
Lebe die nationalsozialistische Bewegung! Es lebe Deutschland!
Did you think it was going to be a lot more racist and political? Yeah, so did I. But here's where the term documentary becomes contested. While the existence of the footage itself doesn't make it propaganda, the way the footage was edited, as well as the music and the position of the camera while capturing it, do make it propaganda. First off, it's estimated that Triumph of the Will had at least 60 hours of footage, of which Leni Riefenstahl had to slim down into 2 hours. What she cut out and what she decided to include is essential to determining whether the filmmaker is being honest about the subject of the documentary or misleading the audience with the way the footage is composed. We've already talked about the notable lack of racism and anti-Semitism, but is this because Leni wasn't able to capture any with her camera? No, there was certainly racism present at the rallies, and she definitely captured it on camera, but that part was strategically left out in the editing process. I think Roger Ebert said it best. The very absence of anti-Semitism in Triumph of the Will looks like a calculation. Excluding the central motif of almost all of Hitler's public speeches must have been a deliberate decision to make the film more efficient as propaganda. Leni Riefenstahl, no matter what she says about her political leanings, or how aware she was of the Holocaust or not, was an avowed Nazi, who knew that her and the party's beliefs were not well received by the world. So in the process of documenting these rallies, she deliberately excludes relevant information about their beliefs in order to portray them in a more sanitized way. Another way Triumph of the Will becomes more propaganda than documentary comes from the actual positioning and framing of the camera. For most documentaries, it'd be harder to fault the filmmaker. Sometimes, as a documentarian, it's hard to find a frame and move as fast as the event is moving, especially if it's a one-time deal. But these are not the conditions in which Leni Riefenstahl made her film. Leni had 5 months of pre-production before the rally. Tracks were laid out in advance, holes were dug so she could get the camera as low as she wanted to go, and part of the rally was specifically organized so she could get some shots. Every shot in this movie, every cut, is intentional on the part of the filmmaker, and they undoubtedly showed the Nazi Party in a favorable light. Take, for example, the low-angle shots of Hitler, framing him as larger than he actually was, juxtaposed with wide shots of crowds cheering at every word, purposely framed to make them seem larger than they actually were. Or the fact that there is a swastika in literally almost every shot in this movie. The entire film portrays Hitler and other party officials as men bigger than themselves, the biggest thing in the frame, and then sweeping shots of other Nazi party members looking on in awe. There's a strong sense of control and uniformity in the compositions and the structure of the film, which also plays into the recurring theme of the speeches that a strong unified national identity is the only way forward. For this, as well as the purposeful exclusion of anti-Semitic and racist sentiments, our Why Triumph of the Will isn't just a documentary, but a propaganda piece. Now, compare this to another film directly inspired by it, Frank Capra's Why We Fight, a pro-US propaganda piece commissioned by the United States government. Influenced by Riefenstahl's film, Capra set out to create a 6-part film series to stoke support for the United States joining the war against the Axis. But instead of using emotions to persuade people like Lenny did, he sought out to approach the concept of propaganda by educating the viewer. The film basically went through Germany and Japan's recent history and how they've been invading their neighboring countries, as well as playing clips of their propaganda films, so that American viewers can see for themselves German and Japanese nationalists spouting claims that they are part of a master race. And to finally get the message across, the final film of the series deals with the principles of freedom and that injustice anywhere was a danger to America itself. There's not much to talk about with Why We Fight, but I thought it'd be an interesting look into the other side of basically the same movie. But now that we've talked about two films that are blatantly and explicitly propaganda, it's time to discuss what happens when a propaganda film isn't just focused on a political party, but also a theme. I Am Cuba is a Cuban-Soviet co-production created just a few years after the end of the Cuban Revolution. Made with a considerable budget for the time and virtually given free rein to do whatever by both the Cuban and Soviet government, a Cuban-Soviet writing duo was brought to write the script, and Mikhail Kalatozov, the Soviet film industry's most renowned director before the Tarkovsky times, teamed up to create the film. At a 140-minute runtime, I Am Cuba consists of 4 separate stories focusing on different people's lives before the revolution and illustrating how horrible things were, all connected by the voice of Cuba, a disembodied narrator who reminds the audience that what they're seeing, that's really Cuba. Before the revolution, Cuba wasn't really seen in the public eye as it's seen today. Cuba was nothing more than a vacation destination for wealthy Americans to enjoy the island vibe, gamble, and partake in sexual tourism. The Cuban economy actually had a lot of money in it at the time. Being under a military dictatorship, the American government had no problems with collaborating with the regime, creating strong trade relations with Cuban landowners and business owners to sell sugar. Despite the tiny island's massive wealth though, the wealth distribution was virtually non-existent, with the contrast between the wealthy Cuban business owners and the sugarcane workers who could only work a few months out of the year and then remain unemployed for the rest, being as clear as day and night. As the camera moves along the Cuban countryside, not focusing on the nicer side that was filled with tourists, but on the parts where impoverished people live, we're reminded by the voice. The people are Cuba, just as much as the nice casinos and resorts. The 4 stories in I Am Cuba go as follows. The first one follows a couple named Maria and René, who are planning to get married. The couple live in poverty, and to make ends meet, Maria works as a prostitute in a gambling casino without telling René. She meets a client that wants to have sex with her in her place rather than the apartment, and is taken aback when he sees her living conditions. Despite this, they continue, and when the man finishes, he throws her some money and takes a necklace from her. As he's about to leave, René enters and discovers what has happened. The second one follows a farmer named Pedro who has just finished growing a crop of sugar. His landlord arrives to tell him the land that he lives and works on has been sold to United Fruit, and that he must leave his home and all of his sugar behind. Refusing to accept this, he gives his children the rest of his money, telling them to enjoy the rest of their day as he burns his home and the crops down, killing himself in the process. The third short deals with Enrique, a young university student protesting the Batista regime who is dissatisfied with the little progress they're making. He decides to go out on his own and assassinate the chief of police, but when he aims at him, he can't bring himself to pull the trigger. He returns to his university to print out flyers, but as the police break in and start arresting political opponents, the protests turn to riots and Enrique is shot and killed. And the final of these stories, and in my opinion by far the weakest, follows Mariano, a farmer who is approached by a revolutionary that tries to convince him to join the revolution and fight for a better future. Mariano tells the soldier that he wants to live in peace, but once the man leaves, Mariano's home is bombed and his son is killed. He then goes to join the revolution and kills someone to get a gun. These 4 stories clearly are meant to stir up revolutionary sentiment in the audience. I don't think anyone would argue against that point. But I think it'd be more interesting to see how I Am Cuba does so compared to Triumph of the Will. With Riefenstahl's film, strong feelings of nationalism are evoked by sweeping shots of crowds and the words of Nazi Party officials speaking on the vague promises of strength and unity if you join the Nazi Party. What Kalatozov does instead of framing the quote-unquote answer to a problem as the main point of the movie, he instead shifts the focus onto that of the problem that needs to be fixed, although revolution is still clearly the right solution here. The stories are, for the most part, completely based in reality. People did prostitute themselves because they weren't making enough money, and most of these clients were American businessmen who knew they could come to Cuba and buy people for cheap. United Fruit as a company did the things this movie says they do, and they did a lot worse than that actually. Political repression and killings were also a commonplace in the Batista regime. It's estimated that in only the last 6 years of Batista's dictatorship, around 20,000 Cubans were killed for political reasons. The stories in this film are grounded in reality, and conceptually it isn't bad that these stories were told. Had the United States allowed this film to be released in the US during the 60s, it probably would have had an effect on how people perceived those living in Cuba, as well as their economic and societal conditions before the revolution. The movie isn't without its flaws though, of course, and it's in these flaws of the film that the label of propaganda begins to stick a little more. Upon its release, I Am Cuba was a massive flop. Citizens of the Soviet Union disliked the film because of the way Americans were presented as too fun and wealthy without sufficiently critiquing them enough. Citizens in Cuba, on the other hand, disliked the film for different reasons. The characters in the story weren't really characters. They were more like robots, reacting to the situations of their oppression, but not completely alive. The characters in the movie don't have personalities or identities, and rather exist only to contextualize the revolution. Interestingly enough though, based on interviews conducted near 2005 for a documentary about the movie, some felt that the biggest issue came from the fact that the movie was made by an external group who weren't as in touch with daily life on the island. Sergio Corrieri, an actor on the film, said, "This really isn't our reality. This character doesn't exist. It isn't Cuban. It was the Cuban reality seen through a Slavic prism." An interesting movie to compare this to, and another one that would technically fall under the term of propaganda, is the 2019 film Sorry We Missed You. The film follows a working-class family in modern-day England as they struggle to get by. I don't want to spoil absolutely everything, but just know that the movie always centers around the characters of the family and how they deal with their current financial situation. We see how they deal with their worsening luck, as they have to sell the car they drive to work, they have to eat less, and they get to spend less time as a family. The kids' behavior changes, and they become more bitter and isolated. Their relationships deteriorate more and more because of the nonstop stress they're constantly enduring. The film also specifically explains and portrays the abusive and exploitive ways larger franchises take advantage of self-employed delivery drivers, a working contract that seems like it's in your favor on the surface, but slowly starts to gouge you of more money that should have been spent instead by your employer. Both Sorry We Missed You and I Am Cuba explore societal issues and oppression, but where Sorry We Missed You succeeds as a film is by centering the characters being exploited, rather than the system doing the exploitation. So now that we've discussed historical uses of propaganda and how it's slowly changed over time, it's time to look into examples of propaganda used in the modern world, and in a way, the reason I made this video in the first place. Obviously, propaganda manifests itself in more obvious ways, such as what kids are and aren't taught in history about their country, but also social media misinformation, like the meddling by Russia in the 2016 United States presidential elections. Both of these are actions taken by governments to influence the opinion or understanding of an event, but film has become something harder to identify in the modern days. Blatantly obvious propaganda documentaries such as Triumph of the Will still exist, and they're also just as easy to spot. Take for example the 2020 documentary Uncle Tom, which posits itself as an oral history of black conservatism in America. The movie is a mess, to put it lightly. It starts off with some basic history, mostly about the fact that back in the old days the Democrats were the racists and the Republicans were not. It then goes on to deny the fact that the party switched in 1936 under Theodore Roosevelt, something that is 100% a fact. It then, in the same breath, accuses the Democrats of virtue signaling to get black votes, while simultaneously virtue signaling that actually the American Republic Party isn't racist because the well-documented switch of political parties didn't actually happen. Very coherent arguments there. The film also goes on to complain about black conservatives not being given the same attention or respect as other political thinkers. But let's think about why that is. Among many of these great black conservative thinkers the movie lists is Thomas Sowell. Now, many people already know why this is funny, but here's the basic rundown of Thomas Sowell's analysis about inequality in modern America. He rejects the idea that black Americans are systemically discriminated against, and that it's both a problem of culture as well as welfare that makes black Americans responsible for the inequality in America today. I'm not going to put in the effort to analyze why this lacks so much relevant information, but check out these videos for a better idea about what his thought process is missing. And to top everything off, Uncle Tom is written, directed, and produced by two white guys, who I'm not going to do any research on, but if I had to guess, had a vested interest in portraying the other side as the real racists and not the Republican Party. Other such biased documentaries exist as well. Recently, there was quite a well-known one made by Matt Walsh called What is a Woman, which, if you can't tell, is basically a trans hit piece. Matt Walsh likes to posit himself as just a guy like you asking questions society is too afraid to answer, but clearly comes into this investigative documentary with an answer in his head. There's quite a few videos on YouTube that analyze this documentary lie by lie, but just to give you the easiest way to understand Matt Walsh and his goals as a filmmaker is in one of the first interviews in the film when he goes to visit a professor of sex and gender to ask him his question, what is a woman? And the guy gives him what I assume to be the correct answer to this question. But Matt Walsh doesn't play that clip. No, instead he overlays different tracks of the man answering him and slowly zooms in on his confused face instead, really making sure that you know that the professor's answer is too complicated for him to understand. I don't believe for a moment that Matt Walsh, someone who self-identifies as a fascist, intended to make a genuine film, and his incompetence as a journalist has made a movie that is frankly just bad and boring. It's bad and boring to watch, and it's also bad and boring to analyze. It's just a film with no thought put into it. I also want to point out that Matt Walsh really only seems to have a problem with trans women existing. I'm sure he's not a huge fan of trans men either, but he sure does love going on and on about trans women, almost as if there's something that personally offends him about a person who once used to be a man that wouldn't want to be that anymore. But moving on from documentaries, propaganda has also entered cinema made for entertainment. Now, it's also important to discuss the way propaganda works together with the society it exists in. The films we've discussed stand by themselves as propaganda, but this isn't the only way it can exist in, because it's also important to discuss the way propaganda works together with the society it was created in. There are a lot of films that, on their own, I don't think would be called propaganda, but still exist to influence public opinion or standards. I recently made a video all about the American military entertainment complex, but to give a brief rundown, there are many movies, Hollywood blockbuster movies, that are being given money or donations in order for the United States military to come on and consult on the portrayal of the military in the film. In a broader sense, though, it's important to recognize a consistent trait in American media that portrays the military and the police as good and necessary to maintain a society. Just take a look at popular American films made about their more recent wars, and notice that if the movie even makes an attempt at criticizing the act of war, the criticism is mostly focused on the trauma of the soldier, rather than the fact that there was a war in the first place, or all the lives that the soldiers destroyed. Or take a look at the fact that the most popular genre of films, superhero films, basically have their protagonists function as vigilantes that are essentially super cops. This also works the other way, of course. Instead of portraying yourself as good and in the right, just portray your enemies harsher. This has transitioned from villains in American movies being Russian, German, or Asian to now mostly being Middle Eastern. But you don't have to be at war with every group that you're trying to attack. You can just be at war against an idea. Take a look at this clip from the Netflix show One Day at a Time.
I know, it's not a perfect match, but it's hardly the sorest thumb in the room.
Not the chair. What the hell are you wearing?
Oh, Che Guevara? Yeah, Viva la Revolucion, am I right?
You are wrong.
Do you have any idea?
I got this.
Do you have any idea?
Kids, relax. Do you have any idea what this come mierda did?
Grew an awesome beard and modeled for t-shirts?
First of all, he wasn't even Cuban. He was Castro's right-hand man.
He burned books, he banned music, he personally oversaw execution squads. He was a mass murderer.
But he has a cool hat.
It's like if you walked into a Jewish home wearing a Hitler shirt.
Or into Taylor Swift's home wearing a Kanye shirt.
Oh my God, you guys, I am so sorry. I had no idea.
So there you see it. The show quickly compares Che Guevara to Adolf Hitler and decides to move on. But if you think about this for a second longer than the show lets you think about it, it's bullshit. It's a bullshit comparison pulled out of nothing to lower the audience's opinion of Che Guevara. The claims made beforehand that he personally banned books and burned music are just blatantly false. The only political power that Che Guevara ever held in Cuba was president of the National Bank for a year and Minister of Economic Industries for 4 years. So, yeah, hardly any positions that would allow Che to create a law that straight up banned music and books. As for the executions, well, that part is true. He did execute quite a few people. But to say that these killings were the same as the killings ordered by Hitler, either in scope, political beliefs, reason for the execution, or in the way people were executed, is grossly disingenuous. To actually hold this opinion, you either have to have a fundamental misunderstanding of the Cuban Revolution and its context, or be minimizing Hitler's crimes. But the show doesn't let you think about that, and it doesn't mention Che Guevara again. It simply asserts a wildly inaccurate and biased statement as fact, and moves on. Another popular subject in propaganda films today are films that have to do with ecology, be it global climate change or veganism. It seems like every year there are a few films released with the specific intent of informing the viewer of how climate change works or how brutal factory farming is. I won't go through any individual films because none of them have really stood out to me, but this is an example of propaganda used for good things, and it's through this point that I'll now move on to the conclusion of the video. Most people have this idea in their head that propaganda was something that was used in the old days, and we pointed examples like Triumph of the Will and I Am Cuba to say, see, if propaganda was being made today, I would be able to identify it. But propaganda has lots of tricks up its sleeve. It can pretend to be an investigative documentary trying to just ask some harmless questions, it can be deliberate misinformation, and it can also be a near constant message claiming that we are the good guys and they are the bad guys. You should engage with every article, book, and film that you watch and ask yourself, what is this trying to make me think, how is it doing so, and why? And we should all remember that the people who are most susceptible to propaganda are the ones who don't think they are.